Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1998 comedy sequel, Blues Brothers 2000. Now, Blues Brothers 2000 has this reputation of being like one of the worst sequels ever made, one of the worst comedies of the 90s, and in all honesty, I've seen worse. That doesn't mean that I think this is a gem. This does not mean that I think this film is underrated. I think it's pretty bad. I think it's definitely a below average, misguided misfire that is mostly off the mark and off key. But there are some moments, to me personally, where it actually is kind of cool and creative. And there are a few scenes here and there that made me chuckle or smirk a little bit. And it's got some great music. So it's one of those movies where I understand why people are not really big fans of it. But at the same time, I would rather watch this than some really bad comedies. Like the Seltzer Burger epic movie parody type films, or some of the other comedies that have come out over the past few years, like Rough Night, for instance. I'd rather watch Blues Brothers 2000 over Rough Night. It's directed by John Landis, and this is this is just more of the same when it comes to John Landis's low point in his career. He just fell off a cliff and just completely crashed and burned after Oscar, really. Oscar was the last decent or good film that he did. And the last film that he did directing wise that actually seemed like the Landis of old. Because after that, it was just a really steep fall in quality. It started with Beverly Hills Cop 3, then it continued with crap like The Stupids, and then you get something like Blues Brothers 2000. You can tell that his heart really wasn't in on this one compared to his daring and dynamic direction in the first movie. It's night and day. It's hard to believe it's honestly the same director, other than the stunt sequences, the little bits that are there, like the car crash sequence or the scene where the police car, the Bluesmobile is driving underwater, or the sequence at the monster truck rally with the loop de loop and the car that's on fire and the Ghost Riders in the Sky number, like, and some of the other musical numbers throughout it. There's a bit of that same verve, that same vitality, that same energy that John Landis provided in the first film, but it's not as consistent. And there's just a lot of moments in this where the comic timing is just not there. It's off. It's awkward. The direction just lingers on certain shots or certain scenes too long. And even the climactic concert sequence, the way that it's shot, it just doesn't have that punch to it, that uh, gravitas that pulls you in like the a finale at the end of the first film, despite there being this all-star group of blues performers. The way that the whole sequence is shot, it looks like something you would see on local public broadcast television. So it's just one of those things where the direction is very flat. It's not great. Landis isn't really getting the most out of the cast either, because he's just honestly leaving the cast out to dry and flounder on screen. And at times it can be really sad to watch, especially when it comes to Dan Aykroyd, who's trying the best he can to make any of his scenes as Elwood work, but because of the fact that Landis just really doesn't have his heart in anything, despite Dan's best efforts, despite his best soulful attempts to bring some spirit into his performance and into the film, it just doesn't click. It just doesn't resonate that strongly. And yeah, the first film had so many sequences that were just ambitious as hell when it comes to the direction, from the establishing shots to the wide shots to the zooms, the pans, the camera angles, so on and so forth. There's not really as many of that here. It's very stock, it's very standard, it's very stiff, it's very blasé and bland. And then you also have a really lackluster screenplay by Dan Aykroyd and John Landis, which, according to Dan Aykroyd, is supposed to be a tribute to the Blues Brothers. It's supposed to be more about the music, less about the plot, less about the laughs. And I'm like, if that's the point, then I could just listen to a Blues Brothers album. And I'm like, why didn't you just do a new album with John Goodman and James Belushi and some other guest stars, or different artists like Blues Traveler? Like, why did it have to be a movie? And for this to be a tribute to John Belushi and John Candy and Cab Calloway, that's just sad, because this is a pretty crappy film. This is a pretty lame sequel that isn't completely awful from a screenwriting perspective or just in general, but it's still pretty bad. So I'm like, that's not really that good of a tribute to those men, to those talented performers, to make a tribute to them, and it's some sucky sequel. Like, it's like, I just don't understand the thought process. I think it was a cash grab. I think that's really what it was. It wasn't anything other than that. It was a soulless cash grab that was made solely for money, and it didn't do well. It did poorly in the box office. And you could really tell that there's not a lot of spirit and soul in this script. First off, it rehashes and copy and pastes numerous plot elements and bits and pieces from the first movie, to the point where there's so many different sequences and moments in this movie where you're like, oh, I remember that from the first movie. Oh, the Russian guy says I broke my watch, like in the first movie. Oh, you have the nun, Sister Stigmata, and she's hitting Elwood with something, like the first movie. Oh, there's a whole church sequence where people are dancing and they're jumping on trampolines, and James Brown is the preacher, like the first movie. Like, there's just so many things in this where you're like, yeah, right, Aretha Franklin's here and she does a musical number, but it's respect instead of think. Oh yeah, because it wants you to think about the first movie. And I'm just like, then I'll just watch the first film again instead of this. It doesn't really help. It doesn't make things better. Like, even some of the attempts to try to do something a little bit different still have this air of familiarity and laziness. Like the whole sequence at the Monster Truck Rally, where they do the Bluegrass Brothers performance. It's Ghost Riders in the Sky instead of Rawhide, but it's a similar sort of thing where they're not a bluegrass band, just like they're not a country band, but they just come up with something on the fly and it's a hit. There's just so many things about it where you're like, yep, uh-huh. Oh, you're gonna crash a million cars? Okay. I remember that in the first film. And that fit better in the first movie because this comes across as desperate. And it doesn't help either that there's barely any plot to speak of. And to be fair, the plot in the first film was not the most uh, deep or complex, and it was fairly simple and straightforward, but it was well put together enough that it helped drive things forward. This plot, there's there's not really anything that feels like it's driving things forward. It's not the relationship between Elwood and Buster. It's not the whole stuff with Elwood getting the band back together again. It's not the stuff involving the Russians and the militia and anything involving those two or the cops. You think that there's going to be something involving Cab, the son of Curtis. Like there's gonna be something involving this character, Commander Cable Chamberlain, and his connection with Elwood. No, not really. A little bit more of a deep, uh, maybe deep thoughts isn't the right word, but deep introspection or some depth involving Cab and his father. No, nothing like that. And yeah, there's a lot of musical numbers, but they just seem more random than they were necessarily in the first film, and a lot of them are just callbacks to the first movie. And it's just a whole thing of Elwood getting out of prison in the beginning and just waiting for Jake for an entire day, but Jake never arrives because Jake is dead. And it's up to Frank Oz's character, who's now got a promotion, to tell him that Jake is dead because he didn't know. It's just really sad. And there's just a lot of elements of the script that are just sad and pathetic. I didn't want to see sad, lonely Elwood waiting for Jake, but Jake never comes to pick him up. It just reminds me even more of what was lost and what we can't get back, which is that dynamic duo of Elwood and Jake. And it's just a stark reminder of the multitude of reasons why this didn't need to be made, like from the very beginning of the script. And apparently, according to some sources, the original script was even bleaker. It started out with that happening and then some dialogue from Elwood about all of his friends died horribly since he was in prison. I was like, Jesus Christ. I get it, Blues Brothers. It doesn't mean you have to take that literally. You have the stuff with Cab, where now he's just trying to catch Elwood. He's become essentially the antagonist until a random point, like over an hour in, when he goes to the tent revival, and the spirit is then shined on him, and then he floats through the top of the tent into the sky, and then God's magic makes him a blues brother. You're like, what the hell? And now there's no real antagonist because I don't count his supporting, his it's not a commanding officer, but I don't count his lieutenant, the second in charge, this gal played by Nia Peeples. I don't count her as an antagonist. The Russians, I guess, but by the end of the script, they're dispatched really easily. So it doesn't seem like they were that much of a threat. And I get it's a comedy, but which is a pretty bad job in terms of making them some semblance of a threat. Like, I felt like the Illinois Nazis were somewhat of a threat. I felt like Carrie Fisher's fiance, she was, her character, the kid, the girl who works at the curl up and dye salon, felt that she was somewhat of a formidable foe. They don't really feel that about anyone in this. Maybe the voodoo queen, but she's clearly not meant to be a villain for the Blues Brothers. And there's just a lot of stuff involving the new Blues Brothers, Mac and Buster and Cab, and Elwood just seems like he's a sidekick. And to be honest, Elwood in a lot of ways was a sidekick. But if you were going to do another Blues Brothers, I just feel that you really should have focused even more on Dan Aykroyd and his character of Elwood Blues. Like, fleshing him out more, knowing more about his backstory, having him be the central focal point instead of this ensemble cast. Because then the ensemble cast just isn't great, isn't really that good. Because there's not a lot of depth to these characters. And they're not really that funny either. And the stuff with the kid is just very cliched. And then when the kid does this whole I'm going to start singing shtick in the end, it's really painful to watch and to listen to because the kid can't carry a tune. And the kid, like, okay, plays saxophone. It's just basically doing the same thing that we already have with Elwood. Oh, he dances. So do the other members. Like, maybe give more screen time to John Goodman's character, to Max, so he can maybe have some semblance of chemistry or connection with Elwood. And the stuff with Cab, like, he's a cop for the majority of the script, and then all of a sudden now he's a blues brother. So they don't really do anything with that either. And all of that being said, there are some moments that I didn't mind. I liked the Ghost Riders in the Sky sequence, especially when it comes to the wild, just really ingenious bit of practical visual effects with the skeletal Ghost Riders in the sky. It was a really cool effect and a really cool scene. And I even liked the way the Blues Brothers made their entrance in that sequence on the flaming loop-de-loop. They were in the car that was on fire on the loop-de-loop. I liked that. I liked the remote control bit with the remote control Bluesmobile. I like the first militia sequence with Daryl Hammond's character. I like the scene where the Bluesmobile is underwater. A lot of the stuff where the script leans hard into the surreal nature of the comedy, like when Elwood is trying to hide from the Russians or the cops in the Bluesmobile, and you don't know where he is. But then I think it was Mac who pulls open a glove compartment, and you see his chin. He's talking. Somehow he found a way to hide himself inside the car in a way that seems humanly impossible. Like, that kind of cracked me up. Or even just the whole concept of the Voodoo Queen and her audition for the Battle of the Bands. But even that has some negatives because the whole Caribbean blues number with Dan Aykroyd and John Goodman and Joe Morton all in green paint, dancing like they're Incredible Hulks. That was a hunk of shit. Like, that was a really shitty sequence. That was really bad. It's like that is arguably probably the worst scene in the entire film. And even the final battle of the bands just felt overlong and played out with this whole, hey, remember all these other blues musicians? They're a part of this other band. And it also made the Blues Brothers just feel like they're nothing, which I don't think that was a great idea. Hey, let's undermine the Blues Brothers in their own movie. That's a great idea. It's a great concept. And like the first film had all this kind of crazy kinetic energy and comic book style uh shenanigans, and there's only a few of that in this. There's only a few moments like that in this script. A lot of the time it's really lazy dumb humor, like the whole thing where Elwood puts all the shaving cream on his head, and Mac acts like he has some kind of bacterial disease. Like, that was a really, really hard scene to watch. Because I'm like, that is the best that you could come up with when it comes to a comedic moment? Is that? That's that's bad. That's really, really bad. And it makes you feel for John Goodman and Dan Aykroyd because it's so bad. And of course the callbacks, like the whole, they're back at Bob's bunk, the Bob's Country diner or whatever it was. They're like, okay, you're back at the same country bar from the first movie. Why? Because first movie. And even the ending, I'm like, what even is this ending? They don't win the Battle of the Bands. Clearly goes to the Super Blues Band that has like Dr. John and Steve Winwood and all these other legendary blues performers and Travis Tritt for some reason. And apparently the Rolling Stones wanted to be a part of it too, but they couldn't make it work with their schedule. That would have been something else. See the Rolling Stones just randomly appear. And you're like, okay. So they lose the Battle of the Bands. The whole stuff with Sister Stigmata and her sisters, because they think that the kid has been kidnapped, and I don't know why they didn't just let the kid go with Elwood. Like, why did it have to be this big drama? And then the kid's saying, well, I'm going to kidnap you, Elwood. And then the kid never really kidnaps Elwood. Elwood and the kid just get in the car again and drive off, and then all these police cars chase after them, and I guess that's it. What about Mac? What about Cab? What about any of these two characters? Like, it's just the Buster and Elwood tour from now on. Like, it's just, what kind of ending is that? Oh, you have the James Brown bit after the end credits where there's this woman of his girlfriend. She's ready to leave him, and he sings, please. It's like, okay, it's fun to see James Brown, but doesn't really make it a worthwhile script or story. Just felt like something you threw in there because you had to pad the runtime. There's a lot of stuff like that in this script. Just padding the runtime with member berries from the first movie and just lame, dumb attempts at comedy that are just incredibly just bottom of the barrel bullshit. And it's just a screenplay that it didn't put a whole lot of thought into, honestly, anything. Like, even the reason for all the cars crashing, they just all crash in one scene. Where in the first film there were multiple different sequences where there were multiple pileups, but here, or you had the scene in the mall. Like, you don't get anything like that in this. It's just that one pileup scene, so it can beat the record set by the first movie in terms of car crashes by one car. It's almost like this was only made just for that reason, and to have the all-star blues band at the end. It's just one of those things where it was just not a good idea, and it just did not work. It was never going to work. But Dan Aykroyd and John Landis just kept trying anyway. And the cast, here's the thing. The cast isn't really that bad, all things considered. Dan Aykroyd, he's not sleepwalking through his scenes. He's trying. He really is. You can tell that he is having fun playing Elwood again. It is something that he took seriously. I mean, he lost a ton of weight to play Elwood again. So he put the effort in. It's just a shame that the same amount of effort that he put into playing Elwood is not there when it comes to the script and the story. Because a lot of his dialogue, a lot of the moments with him, they're not really that funny. And I know Dan Aykroyd can be funny, but there's a lot of stuff in this where it just doesn't provide any laughs. And John Goodman, he can be funny too, and he's got energy, and he seems like he's having a good time, like when he sings the songs and everything. But there's really not a whole lot for him to do in this. And I like him, but he doesn't really have that good of chemistry with Dan Aykroyd. Probably because they don't share that many scenes together, where it's just them, one-on-one. I know James Belushi was supposed to be in it, which makes a lot of sense. You know, it's John's brother, but he had a scheduling conflict with some TV show, so we couldn't do it. I still think it would have been bad, but it would have been interesting to have seen what James Belushi could have brought to it. Joe Morton, I mean, what can I say? Like, he does the best he possibly can with what he's given. Plays a good stern cop. Actually carries a pretty surprisingly good tune when he's Cab. But other than that, I mean, the character, there's really not a lot there. J. Evan Bonifant is Buster. Yeesh. Like, this kid, he can dance, that's about it. Because he has no personality, no charm, no charisma, and he clearly is a poor man's Dollar Tree, Dollar General Macaulay Culkin. That's really what he is. I'm surprised they didn't try to get one of Macaulay Culkin's brothers to be in this as Buster. Or even Buster Bunny for Tiny Toons. At least then it would be like, oh crap, it's Buster Bunny. He's the new Blues Brother. That's a wild direction. Steve Cropper, Donald Duck Dunn, Murphy Dunn, Willie Hall, Tom Malone, Lou Marini, Matt Murphy, Alan Rubin. They all come back and reprise their roles as members of the Blues Brothers band. And they can still play their instruments well. They're not good actors, though. And they're given a lot more screen time and a lot more lines. And it's pretty pitiful. The other musical guests, you got Erykah Badu, who plays Queen Missette. I mean, she's gorgeous to look at in this, but I can't really say a whole lot about this role that she has. Blues Traveler appears as themselves. You got this super band, you know, the Louisiana Gator Boys. You have Wilson Pickett and Sam Moore. James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Eddie Floyd, Lonnie Brooks, Kathleen Freeman is back as Stigmata. Frank Oz, he reprises his role from the first movie. Nia Peeples plays a state police officer. Daryl Hammond from SNL, he's a militia member. Paul Schaefer plays Queen Missette's major domo. Paul Schaefer, he was actually a member of the Blues Brothers band. And he was supposed to be in the Blues Brothers, but he had a scheduling conflict because he was doing Guild Alive. And that made it so he couldn't do Blues Brothers, but he was able to do Blues Brothers 2000. And the Louisiana Gator Boys. You got Jeff Skunk Baxter. You got Gary U.S. Bonds, Eric Clapton. Yes, that Eric Clapton. Clarence Clemens, Jack D. Johnette, uh, Bo Diddley, John Faddis, Isaac Hayes, Dr. John, B.B. King, Tommy Pipes McDonald, Charlie Musselwhite, Billy Preston, Lou Rawls, Joshua Redman, Paul Schaefer, Coco Taylor, Travis Tritt, Jimmy Vaughn, Grover Washington Jr., Willie Weeks, and Steve Winwood. It's like, okay, you definitely got a lot of star power in this, but that doesn't really make for a good or even really that enthralling or entertaining movie, surprisingly enough, despite all the star power. And I know at one point in development, speaking of the cast, Dan Aykroyd wanted Chris Farley to co-star with him, but this is when Chris was not doing too well in terms of the drugs and so on and so forth. And by the time they started filming, Chris is no longer around. And I think the film probably would have had a high probability of not being good. But I think the best chance that a Blues Brothers sequel could have had to have been worth it or to be fun or entertaining or funny would be to pair Dan Aykroyd and Chris Farley. Like, that could have been a fun duo. I think that had potential to work, but we never got to see that because Chris, sadly, like his idol John Belushi, he hit the drugs too much. He hit the drugs too hard, and it wound up killing him. Just like this movie killed the franchise, if there even was a franchise to kill, and killed the career of John Landis, killed the career of Dan Aykroyd as a leading man. And I can't really say a whole lot about the other technical elements like the cinematography by David Harrington or the editing by Dale Belden because it's just very average, run of the mill, mediocre stuff. And like, it's a long movie too, just like the first film, but it drags and it gets dull and it's not anywhere near as entertaining as the first film. And there are so many moments where it just feels like scenes are stretched out to almost an interminable length. And that doesn't do the film any favors either. So yeah, it's just one of those misguided, poor sequels. Poorly conceived, poorly executed, but at the end of the day, the cast is not that bad. It does have some good music. There are a few scenes that are showing some semblance of inspiration or creativity, but this one is definitely going to give you the blues. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Blues Brothers 2000. Until next time, I'll see you later. See you.